Good evening, everybody. Welcome this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. It is good to see you all with us this evening, and especially our guest speaker, Rob Curtis. Thank you so much for being with us this evening, Rob. We are looking forward to tonight's presentation. This is the second week of follow-up to last week's presentation. And in this series, we're closing out our season of creation with two talks to heighten our awareness of the environment, the world around us, and creation. So my name is Reverend Nanette Pitt, and I am the pastor here at First Congregational Church of Akron, where we're hosting tonight's talk. And we are so pleased to have you with us this evening. I am here in downtown Akron, where we have been a church since 1833. And so in that time, we have seen a great deal of change in this area. One can just imagine the ecological change as things developed, even as the Cuyahoga River at one time burned. And so we find ourselves now in this time and place, asking ourselves, in light of our history and in light of our future, in light of the climate crisis that is evident in the world around us, how we can make a difference in our own backyards. So I wanted to welcome again Rob Curtis, our guest speaker. Rob, since an early in his life, has had a fascination with the wildlife and the outdoors, a fascination that continues today. He's a lifelong resident of this region and has a great love for it. He works, of course, as the supervisor of ecological resources for the Summit Metro Parks. And he also has a bachelor's degree in wildlife and fisheries science from Pennsylvania State University. At Summit Metro Parks, Rob oversees all the park inventories and assessments, and he manages most ecological restoration projects. So he has a wealth of knowledge to share with us this evening. And Rob, we are so grateful to have you with us and are looking forward to this presentation. Please feel free during the course of the presentation to add your comments in the chat. If you've got any questions for Rob, please feel free to ask those in the chat. And then we will move to have a time of Q&A afterwards, although we will ask some questions in between as well, if necessary, if it feels like those are helpful. So Rob, I'm glad to hand over to you. So please take us away.
Okay, thank you, Reverend. Well, I'm excited to be here. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart that I'll be going over today, and one that Summit Metro Parks is becoming more engaged with. As we move into our second centennial, this is our centennial year as well. So not as old as 1833, but 1921 is when we started. And I think that's when a lot of attention started turning toward conservation in general, because we were largely agricultural at that time. But our park district, I've been with the park district for about 15 years, and we have, in that time, doubled our land holdings. And with the celebration of our centennial this year, we planted 100 acres of forest. We're completing that this month, maybe next month, we'll be completing that for our centennial year. And we're going to be starting to move into a backyard biodiversity focus, working with our neighbors to help some of what I'm going to be talking about today, and help us and our yards and our footprints be a little bit more friendly to the ecology around us. So here I will share my screen and start a presentation. Can everybody see that now? I will assume affirmative on that. So yes. This is a backyard biodiversity and the Half Earth Project. I've had a couple name changes, I think, since it went out. I apologize for any confusion. Again, my contact information is in the lower left-hand corner, and I'll give it again. I would encourage anyone, I'll be covering a lot of subject matter. Feel free to take screenshots or take pictures of the screen if you want any of the information that will be on there. There will be a number of different reference and pieces of reference information on the screen at various times. As Reverend Nanette mentioned, you can post questions in the chat and we'll get to those afterwards. And I always welcome comments, and I love to give out information. I'm very passionate about the subject in general. So feel free to contact me at any time in the future. General outline of today's talk, we'll be going over really the biggest global problems. I'm going to narrow it down to one problem. The half-Earth concept, local conditions, how we kind of fit into a global plan, understanding what biodiversity is, why it's important, and some of the differences between natives and non-native species, a personal transformation that I went through about 15 years ago, starting about 15 years ago, and how you can really engage in decreasing a carbon footprint and really implement some personal practices that can go a long way in changing climate change. Some of the concepts we heard last week with Dr. Schreiber, global warming, and the biodiversity problem that we face. And so if you look up the top global problems right now, climate change usually comes up toward the top in almost any site that you will check out, along with some of these other types: pollution, war and violence, government corruption, food and water shortages, poverty, things like that. These are the things we normally think of as top global problems. Rarely you'll see ecological issues, biodiversity, extinction as listed, but they're really inherent in this, because all of the problems that we're talking about, that we talked about last week related to climate change, and all of these problems really have to do with life on Earth, human beings, human life, life on Earth. This would not be a problem if we were a planet like Mars or like the moon or some other planet. The fact that we have life on this blue planet is what makes these issues so important, because they threaten life as we know it. So really the top problem in my mind, the reason all those are problems are because of the loss of life on Earth, or the loss of biodiversity. And because we're all interconnected, of course, this is an issue. You lose one thing and it has a cascade effect on lots of other things. So right now we're, depending on who you talk to, we're looking at about 25% or so of our species are threatened with some sort of endangerment or extinction. And that's largely due to a lot of the issues that I have here, such as habitat loss. These are historically the primary issues causing extinctions and loss of biodiversity. Habitat loss is probably number one. I mean, if they don't have a place to live, then they're pretty much extinct already. Fragmentation of habitats is really in the same vein. So habitat loss and fragmentation are probably two of the most important issues related to extinction. Introduction of non-native species is also very high on the list. We'll be talking about that more today. Global warming, obviously, is a problem, and is probably, as that really takes hold on Earth, is of course going to be more and more of a driver of extinction if we don't slow it down and or stop it in the future. Other items like pesticide, light pollution, and there's a myriad of other anthropogenic issues that are causing extinctions. But most of the biggest ones are listed on the screen, and a number of these we can have a direct impact in our own yards. So the Half Earth project is started by Dr. E.O. Wilson, which, if you haven't heard, he is a famous biologist. He really catapulted the term biodiversity. It was used a couple times before he did, but in the mid 80s, he really took that term and highlighted it, and it has given it its wide acceptance now that it has. He developed this concept of half Earth because of his passion for our Earth, the species that are here, and the ecosystems that are here. He is an entomologist himself. You can look up, I have the links in the screen. Of course, those won't work, but you can look up his website, halfearthproject.org, and find a lot of information there. And his dream, really, which is to protect half of the Earth for all of the other species besides humans, and half of the Earth for humans. And this is based on a species area curve relationship, which is basically that you start off with a lot of smaller species. You can start off protecting a lot of species with just a small piece of land. And as you increase in size, you'll gain a few more. But you can capture a lot of species with small portions of land to start with. And then there's just usually a few species that need really big tracts of land in the end. So this is a species area curve with natural area percentage on the bottom and percent of species preserved on the side. This is just a hypothetical situation, but this is where we are roughly right now. Global protection is about 15%, and this includes ocean as well as land. So that, in general, according to the species area curve, means that we could, at this point, with current protection, preserve about a little over 50% of the species on Earth, which, of course, that means there's 40 some percent species that would become extinct at this rate if that's all we protect. So his dream is to get to 50%.
Rob?
Yeah.
Nanette here. Just had a question about can you explain what you mean when you say protection? Does that mean conservation? Does it mean
That's a good question.
Preservation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it varies. Typically it's referring to land that is set aside for natural processes. But there are variants of that where, sometimes like logging, some things can be done, or sometimes as minimal as research. So usually there's some type of degree of multiple use, but if it's primarily set aside for conservation, that's, I think, what this number is referring to. So E.O. Wilson feels that to protect 85% of species on Earth from going extinct, we need to protect about 50% of our land. And I'm not going to dive into this too much today, but it's important what pieces of land. It can't just be little pieces and parts all over the place. It needs to be in strategic locations, like the tropics, for example, where we have lion's share of biodiversity, and certain coral reefs around Australia and things like that. So it would be strategic areas. But to kind of bring this home, we can sort of see how, our responsibility, I feel, at Summit Metro Parks as a conservation organization in the region, that we have a local part to play in this, as we all do on our own properties if we own land in the area. So I wanted to go over some local conditions to kind of see how that plays out with E.O. Wilson's, some of his concepts. So this is based on 2016 data of Summit County and surrounding areas, and it's just land use data. It shows urban and developed areas in red, and less intensively used areas in yellow and blue, and then more natural land areas in greens. So right now in Summit County, we are about 2/3 developed. And this isn't protected, this is developed. So we have about 1/3 of our landscape that is in some form of natural state, and available for potential protection. How much of that is protected? Roughly the same amount that is protected globally. So on a global level, we had about 15%, which admittedly is largely pieces of ocean. In our case, we have about 13%. And 13% in context of the United States is actually pretty good. We have a couple conditions in Summit County, one being we have a national park, two being we're part of a state that has allowed legislation for regional county conservation parks, like our Summit County Metro Park, and a lot of counties in our region have these metro parks, which is not common throughout the country. So we have a couple advantages here in Summit County, and we're still just barely, we just got 13%. So on a 50% scale, we've got a long way to go. So this is again how that looks under current conditions. So what I'd like to talk about for the remainder of our talk is how I think we can get there in the future with some practical steps. If we garden, if we use our gardens and our landscapes to help to get them back to more of a natural state, we can become part of the solution, part of the connections, and part of the natural area restoration in Summit County. What that would look like is something like this. If we just turn residential and low intensity developed land in and around Summit County and greened it up with native species, reducing our lawn, reducing our footprint, our heavy footprint on the land, then we would be able to connect our natural areas and gain a lot more. We'd be able to basically flip the tables and be 80% natural or semi-natural to 20% urban. So this is the concept that we're going to kind of be shooting for. A couple things that are happening rapidly right now that we really need to start to slow down or stop are the fact that our natural areas are being quickly and permanently destroyed and fragmented by development. Just the continual sprawl is just never ending. I live in Talmadge, and they just turned a golf course into another shopping center here. So that land is now not available really for restoration anymore. It's pretty much gone for all intents for the near future. A lot of residential landscapes are very hostile to native biodiversity, using almost exclusively non-native species that are useful to the biodiversity of other continents, but not to our native biodiversity. And these non-natives that we're using in our landscapes, furthermore, are escaping into our last remaining natural areas, and basically turning our last remaining natural areas into exotic environments that our native biodiversity can no longer use. So these are really three fronts of attack on our local ecology that are really destroying and sometimes irreversibly destroying and moving that needle further the other direction. So we need to slow this and stop it and see if we can reverse it. So I wanted to just take a few minutes and explain biodiversity. On the surface, it seems pretty easy to understand, and I don't mean to be going over the obvious, but a lot of these concepts, even biologists argue about. So there's thought to be about 8 million species. That's a pretty good estimate. Some people, depending on how you define species, will say that it ranges anywhere from 2 to 10 million, but depending on whether you call them subspecies, species, and things like that. But in general, I think most people accept about 8 million species in the world right now. About 3.5% of those species are plants, and that 3.5% produces pretty much all the food for all of the other life forms on Earth as the primary producers. So that means that about 30 species of animals and fungi are dependent on one plant species. Recognizing that a lot of species, 75% in fact, are dependent on certain plants, like a monarch is dependent on milkweed and a koala is dependent on eucalyptus. That sort of pattern goes throughout a lot of our natural areas. So if we lose a plant, we're taking roughly 30 other species with it. If we lose a plant to extinction on average. And I'm oversimplifying some of these concepts, but to try to get you to see where we're going with the plant versus animal relationships. Now I want to talk a little bit about native versus introduced. And there are a lot of different definitions of what native is. Some people just consider species native to Summit County that were here originally at the time of earliest settlement. Some people could, broaden the category to anything on the continental, on North America. And what I'm using is a functional and adaptive way of looking at native species. I'm broadening it to a biome concept, which is basically Eastern United States. So it excludes the tropics, it excludes the prairie Midwest, and it excludes the boreal forest to our north, but all of the deciduous forested region from Florida to Maine and from the Atlantic to the Midwest is basically what I think, as far as is a good biodiversity concept of native. And this gives us some, when we're talking about using native plants for our landscape, this gives us it gives us a pretty large palette of species to work with. So there's interesting species from the south that we can use. So we're not just using goldenrod and things that grow wild right here. We can sort of broaden our palette a little bit. There's species that are safe. They're not going to be aggressive or invasive here, because if they were going to be, they would already have moved in the last, several thousand years. So they've already got an equilibrium in this forest biome, and they're going to pretty much stay put, except for climate change. So we could actually be facilitating species movements with climate change by using, for example, southern species. If we use things like beautyberry or silverbell or fringe tree in our landscapes, which are southern shrubs and woody plants, we could be setting the stage for the species to be moving rapidly northward, or their host biodiversity to be able to, if they need to move northward because the temperature is rising, their host plants might be here already if we have them in our yards. So we could actually be facilitating quick adaptation necessary for our biodiversity by using southern species of plants. Anything on another continent certainly should be considered non-native, and we should try to avoid. So if it's got the word Norway in it, pretty much we don't want to use it. These plants are adapted to support species in their regions and are not producing or supporting our native biodiversity here. So plants and biodiversity. In general, native plants, our native plant species from Eastern United States are supporting all of our native biodiversity. And the introduced plants or plants from other continents are more or less, except for some generalist species, are sterile. So every time we use a Norway maple, a Norway spruce, a Japanese maple, we're basically putting a sterile plant in the environment that has very little utility for the biodiversity around us. And furthermore, those can then invade natural areas, which all of the species I just mentioned are doing. And they're sterilizing our natural areas and making them unsuitable for our native biodiversity as well. So it's really a much larger problem than people realize when they just see a lush green area. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's very productive for our biodiversity. So to sort of rethink how we use our landscape, how we use our lawns and our hedges and our trees around us, we really need to flip on its head the way we think about pests. Pests are the biodiversity that we want to support. So really the term pest is a word that I'm really trying to limit how I use the word pest from now on. If we have things consuming our rows at our home, that's not necessarily a pest. That might be something we are trying to support or wanting to support. And so almost planting for the wildlife is what we're trying to do. Because if we're looking for pest-free plants, we're basically saying that we don't want our biodiversity. We want the biodiversity somewhere else. And if everybody does that, then the biodiversity has nowhere to go. So thinking of a monarch example, if we want the monarch, we have to have the whole package, and we have to be willing to put up with some of this. Some holy plants, those caterpillars need to eat something. The adults are not the only ones that need to feed. So when I grow my milkweed in my yard, I like to see holes in my plants because then I know they're being useful to our native biodiversity. The person who really drove this home for me is another entomologist named Doug Tallamy, who I'm sure some of you have probably heard if you're into native landscaping at all. He really the light bulbs turned on for me when his book came out, Bringing Nature Home. And I was a fairly new homeowner at the time, and just thinking about landscaping my own yard. And really what he was saying is by using native plants and certain types of native plants, we could bring nature right to our doorstep, and actually be building our landscapes for nature rather than just for the plant itself. And I'm having some slide trouble. Okay. This is his website. He had a website called Bringing Nature Home. Still, if you look that up, it'll take you here. He's got he's got an idea and a plan now that is similar and in line with E.O. Wilson's Half Earth project called Homegrown National Park, where basically he's taking the idea that I already kind of went over in Summit County. If we can take our yards and all of the green space that basically is just growing turf, or even half of it, and convert it to natural areas that can be used by our biodiversity, we can become even larger than any of our national parks and connect the national park and actually gain millions of acres of natural area land in the United States and start to actually turn the tide of this extinction crisis. So this website there's a wealth of information on this site, and I would encourage you to check it out. He's got some other videos that are pre-recorded that go over some of these concepts that I'm talking about in more detail. And in a lot of ways, he explains it a lot better. He's been doing this for a long time, so he's definitely one of my heroes. And right at the bottom of the front of the page, you can click on this button, and it can take you to some native plants for your own area. And it'll actually take you to a number of different places you can go. I always go to this one from the National Wildlife Foundation. And this is one that Doug Tallamy himself has put a lot of time into. He's going to, the website that you go to is hosted by the National Wildlife Federation, and it's going to go over different trees and shrubs, all native, and it's going to highlight you put your zip code in, so it'll give you kind of a local selection, and it'll tell you based on a local scale how many. He works with mostly lepidopterans, which are butterflies and moths, but oak, for example, will host up to 477 species of butterflies and moths. So you can start to use this tool to determine what species will perform the best for the highest amount of biodiversity on your property. So oak is definitely the number one in this region for hosting lepidopteran species, specifically white oaks, swamp white oaks or white oak. But you can go on down the list. And so it's a really useful tool for selecting trees based on these pests or lepidopterans, and they're so important for birds, caterpillars specifically. You want a lot of species and you want a lot of biomass if you want your birds to be able to perform well. Birds utilize caterpillars heavily, almost all species, in the summer for rearing their young, and they use a lot of them. So he goes over some of that on his site and his video. But this is what we need to be doing in our yards if we want to be supporting our biodiversity. And you can work this tool the other way around. When you click on the oak, it'll show you all of the different butterflies and moths and their caterpillars and things that host on the oak. And you can say, for example, select something for a Luna moth. If you want to attract Luna moths to your yard, it'll tell you what species you could plant to get Luna moths. Like we know if we want monarchs, we want to plant milkweed. So you can do that with any of the Cecropia moths, Luna moths, some of the high profile things you might want to see in and around your yard. It is a nice tool. So now I'm just going to try to maybe whet your appetite a little bit with showing you my personal transformation, which started with Doug's book about 15 years ago. This is my simple property in Talmadge. It's about an acre, and it was mostly lawn when I moved in about 20 years ago. Pretty plain, not a lot of landscaping. The landscaping that was there is mostly like hostas and non-native species. This is a shot from my front door. My daughter, who's her first day of school, she's just graduating college next month, so gives you a little timeline. You see my corner fence there, only 80 feet wide, and it's a really long property. But again, it was all turf. One of the first things that I did, and I would recommend if you're doing any decent amounts of landscaping, is to get a property survey. Once I did that, I found out that lo and behold, my fence wasn't even on my property. And that just helps to, I was going to put a fence in and do some things to prevent my landscape plants from sort of flopping over into my neighbor's yard. I was trying to be as unoffensive as possible when I started. It was a learning process, but the boundary survey was really important. Another thing you want to do is look at local ordinances. There are a lot of old, antiquated ordinances on the books, which in many cases discourage native land use. They're really relics from a time when nature was bad, and we wanted to keep it at bay. So it's a lot of things like milkweed that are illegal in many of our local ordinance, our local codes. So it pays to look those up and just know what they say, so you know how to handle them on your own property. And so maybe you can talk to your zoning boards about potentially changing zoning laws. But in any case, I used it. I'm just give some example of some different zoning laws. Specifically, there's usually grass height laws. They don't like things to be weedy or look unkept. So these are things you want to keep in mind when you're doing it, when you're native landscaping. Certain species are just, there's a lot of misinformation on the sites. Some species like poison oak don't even live in this region. Other species like daisy are plants that a lot of people like in their gardens. So a lot of the stuff doesn't make sense, but I think most of the points are they don't want it to look unkept and reduce property values. So there are good ways to do it. Not necessarily saying that the way I did it is one of them, but to get around the long grass, I started my landscaping by removing my lawn so that it wouldn't be long and offensive. You can see I put a fence around the corner in front there, and that's both to again keep my plants from moving into another property. It also keeps my leaves in. There's a mesh fencing there because I use the leaves for natural mulch. I wanted this to be kind of a forested garden. So leaves are really important for a forest garden as our natural mulch. So I did it first by removing my lawn and then in-planting a lot of native trees and shrubs and wildflowers. And that's how I started, and it was my garden. So I used it as a garden, and that's how I kind of got around some of my zoning. But we'll watch this particular area because I'm going to show it to you after about 7 years, and you'll see the change to this zone. Again, my side yard, and this is my side yard now. I've got some rain barrels collecting rainwater and redistributing that, so I'm not using city water or anything. My landscaping is now native plants. This is my other side. I'm using some showy species. I got another rain barrel. This is how the front was, and this is how it looked in 2014. There was still right front and center there, that yellowish shrub is a non-native Asian shrub, which is no longer there. I've since gotten rid of that one, but everything else really is native, and you can see it looks fairly attractive, I think, and beauty's in the eye of the beholder, but it does not have to look bad. So again, I have here's a picture of my front yard and then what it looks like really from the same angle about 7 years after I started the landscaping. You can see the forest. That's the forest where I had removed the turf. So it looks like a forest. I think it looks pretty nice. I don't know if all my neighbors necessarily agree, but I can't see the road anymore. Here's another photo of my front. This is my front in the spring, and I have a National Wildlife Federation sign to help sort of demonstrate to my neighbors or anybody who's curious why my lawn looks like that, why I'm doing what I'm doing. You can get those placards from the National Wildlife Federation. This is how it looks later in the year. So you can see it doesn't have to look, real weedy. It can look nice. Just a couple different angles. I don't, it's not all natural. I definitely mow areas of my yard, but I've got about half, I've turned about half of my yard into natural area and maintain a nice boundary line for my neighbors. I keep a couple different, I keep track of my property, actually probably more for demonstration purposes and doing these kind of talks, but if any of you are familiar with iNaturalist, that's what I use to track the species on my property. I've got about close to 500 species of plants that I have, native plants that I have put on my property or were already there previously. So that number of plants is what is supporting all of the biodiversity. And I'm trying to record the biodiversity the best I can in another project. So I'm actually right around 1,300 species of plants and animals that are occupying my landscape after changing it to native. So I think my property is being fairly well used. These are some of the species that are using my property. I'm going to show you a bunch of the other things that I've recorded, but when I started doing this, you saw my daughter getting ready for the school bus there. She got interested in photography and she took a lot of these photos. But all these photos that I'm going to show you in the next few slides are from wildlife that we've seen on our property, and they're actually photos that we took. So this is just a smattering of the fungi that I have found on my property and since I've started the native landscaping. And you'll just see there's a fascinating array of different colors and textures and species that you get when you let the ecosystem be what it was designed to be in this region, which means you let dead wood stay on the ground. You might move it around a little bit so it doesn't, there's a balance between looking a little too rugged and maintaining a reasonable presence in a residential land, residential area. So, but I think we can all do it. It just might take some creative thinking. These are pollinators that I've documented, or my daughter has documented on the plants in our landscape, and just hundreds of different species, things you would never think you would even see until I started landscaping. They found it. They have wings and they get there if the species are there that they want. Lots of butterflies. And again, I was doing this when my kids were young, so this is what they grew up with, and this was their playground. And I personally think it was a great experience. It would encourage anyone to do the same thing. Different moths. Just fascinating, really. And not all of the species. There are some non-natives in here, and there are a few things that I had to deal with, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But just fascinating caterpillars. I was always in amazement at some of the caterpillars, like spicebush swallowtail and zebra swallowtails, and just incredible things to find it when you set the stage. Some of the herbivores like aphids and tree hoppers, occasionally you can plant a certain native species, and one year they may almost devour all of your plants. And a couple times I was thinking they were going to wipe out my milkweed, for example, and then the next year a predator would move in and devour all the aphids. And so it takes several years sometimes for the ecosystem to sort of balance itself out. But that the process is just fascinating to watch. And I would just encourage you to sort of approach it from as natural a means as you can, because the predators will come. So you don't have to use insecticides. In fact, I would discourage all use of insecticides. And I do use a minor amount of glyphosate herbicide. I did for my lawn control, and I do that for some of my plant management, invasive species management in my yard. So I do still do some yard work. It's not just, mowing the lawn 30 times a summer. I'm in there weeding certain non-natives out and making it look the way I want it to look. So I would venture to say I spend about the same amount of time I would if I was mowing, maybe a little bit less, but I'm still doing a lot of management. You'll see just, once you get the invertebrates, then the birds come and the rabbits, and then, every about a year, my rabbit population gets wiped out because the coyotes or the foxes come in and capitalize on that food source. Now, there's a lot of things that most people think are of as pests that are actually helping to control the invertebrates and utilizing the plants and other capacities. So again, challenge yourself with the concept of pest. These are part of the ecosystem and part of our biodiversity that we want to keep and sustain. There are real pests, though. These are a few of them that I have had some difficulty with: carpenter bees, mosquitoes, woodchucks, deer. Deer have been really difficult when I was getting started doing the landscaping. I had to figure out fencing and use some soap and hot sauce mixes and things like that to get around the deer just destroying my landscape as I was building it. Now I have so many plants that they can't possibly destroy everything. But for a few years, I was having a lot of difficulty with some of these things. And we had termites in our house before we moved in, so we knew we had those. And we do use a termite control bait that is very specific to just termites. But I do use minimal amounts of things in and around my house, and they're things that I wanted to show you because I don't want to paint it all as just all as rosy. There are some issues that you have to deal with, poison ivy that gets in and around. But they're not insurmountable, and they're not even that big of a deal. They're just things that you need to address from time to time. So I would encourage all of you that are watching to both, consider some of these activities in your own landscape, and consider, your lawns and what is necessary. Why are you mowing what you're mowing? Do you have to mow it all? Now, if you're in a small city lot, the answer may be yes, you have to mow a majority of what you have. But I would even say in some of those areas, you should really think hard about why you're doing it. If you can plant some trilliums and native shrubs and things in place of your lawn. And just make sure it's what you're doing. And I haven't even really mentioned the carbon footprint too much today, but if you can stop mowing, not only are you reducing the carbon emissions from the mowing and increasing your biological carrying capacity in the area. But if you're planting trees and things like that, you're actually pulling a lot of carbon potentially out of the system. Trees are really important, not only for biodiversity, but for carbon sequestration. So just another thing to consider along with the climate change. And then consider all the other things you're doing, working with nature rather than against it. You know, I've been working with my dad and some of my neighbors about, you know, why they take all their leaves to the road in the fall and then pull all the red mulch in the spring and put it around their yard. Why don't they just see if they can work with their leaves? If you fence in certain ways and use your plantings, they can really trap in leaves and you don't need mulch. Reduce pesticides. Use your water from your gutters if you can. Change your lighting. Lighting is both an issue for power consumption, going to LEDs, using motion detectors. If you can use motion detectors, that's great outdoors because lights left on all night are wreaking havoc for a lot of insect species, especially moths and some beetles. In some cases, there's a few species that we're losing completely because of lighting. So if you can change your lighting to not only reduce emissions, but only come on when you need them to come on, not all night long, or if they need to be all night long for some security reason, change them to bug-free lighting. That would be great. Remove introduced species. I just can't emphasize that enough. That is one of the #1 things that we spend our time on in the metro parks is removing non-native species. Plant native species. You're basically extending the footprint of the parks into your own yards by doing that and helping our local ecology. Think of planting diverse. The more plants you plant, the more invertebrates you support, the more of the ecosystem you support. Think of planting vertically, not just on the ground, but the shrubs as well, and all the way up to trees. So you got 3-dimensional space you can use. Be creative with some of the zoning laws. Either discuss them with your city or local zoning reps, or find creative ways of working with the laws and still being able to use a portion of your land for nature. And I do want to emphasize that things change. Some of the photos I showed you today, when I look out at my yard now, it's completely different now. So you know, you plant these things and in 5 or 10 years they don't look the same anymore. So think long term. That small tree is not going to be small for long, and expect change. There's going to be, as I've mentioned, critters move in, the predators move in, and things are just always changing, and that's actually part of the fascination. I wanted to go over a few native plant sources for those of you that might be interested in pursuing this. Soil and water conservation districts are a great place to start. I mean, now is a great time to start. We're starting a whole new really season. You could start to think about this and plan out, potentially even start removing some non-native species. And in the springtime, a lot of these native plant sales are moving forward in March, April, and May. They don't even have dates on the books yet. I just checked, but they usually will be taking orders in the first of the year, January, February, and then you can be putting plants in the ground in April, May. Summit County Soil and Water Conservation District is great. They've been working with us for years, and they sell only native species, and quite a good variety. You can check with all of the different soil and water. Oftentimes you'll get a lot of different species that way in your selection. Not all of them sell just natives, though. There are some that will still sell Norway spruce and things like that. Local land conservancies like ourselves. I mentioned already that we're going to kick off a backyard biodiversity program. I'm not sure what it's going to be called yet, but next year. And that's going to start with a plant sale. May 28th, we're going to bring in vendors, native plant vendors, and we're going to be doing giveaways ourselves from local plants. The organizations like the Wilderness Center down in Stark County has a plant sale. Stark Parks also has a plant sale every year. Cleveland Metro Parks hold an arboretum. There's a lot of places that have native plant sales, and then the vendors themselves. We're going to be bringing in some vendors next May. Some of these vendors will probably be coming in, but you can call them, and a lot of times they'll do mail orders. I mean, this is just a short list of local ones that we are familiar with and work with. We have a much larger list, or you can find them online. I would love to help anyone to find what they need, whether it's figuring out how to determine what's native and what's not, or figuring out places to purchase the material. I would be happy to help. And then, you know, if as you work on your own areas, encourage your neighbors to join. The more people we can get to be doing the same thing, the more connections we make, the more biodiversity we are supporting. And get involved with your municipalities if you can to update some of these ordinances and even change zoning. I know in my area, the only good land is developed land, and it's really sad to see. They just have our local zoning just has no concept of a woodlot for nature. And it's really discouraging, but it takes outspoken folks to start to change that. And I know there are some in Akron and Hudson and Richfield, and so it's not all the localities that are terrible, but it takes us all kind of doing our part. And with that, I will conclude my talk. I really thank you for hearing me. And if anyone has any questions, I know there were some already in the chat, but I'd be happy to field any questions now.
Thank you so much, Rob. We really enjoyed that. And we do have a few questions. I wanted to ask, so a lot of what you shared can feel overwhelming or scary. What makes you stay positive in the work that you do when you're seeing extinctions happen, sprawl, fragmentation? What keeps you feeling positive?
That's a great question. I don't always feel real positive. I mean, I try to be realistic, but you know, much like E.O. Wilson and Doug Tallamy, I mean, we can all do our part. We can't do everything, but we can do as much as we can do, and we can support the wildlife around us. And if we can do it in a winsome fashion, you know, one person becomes two and two becomes four, and it starts to spread. And, you know, this is just an idea. This is an idea that started a couple years ago, really, and it's gaining a lot of traction, and there's hope here. Where it seemed like most of our nature was going away, now there's some possibilities looming where we could help restore some things right in our own yards. So sometimes it's just continuing to chew on these difficult situations and looking for solutions and jumping on board with the best thing that we have, the best options that we have at the time, and hoping that other things will come on down the road.
Yeah. Annika and Rudy asked, how can we balance the need to protect and preserve biodiversity with the galloping growth of population and urbanization and the industrialization that comes with it?
Yeah, that is a bigger question than I can answer. I mean, I have my fine scale ideas. I do feel that some of the concepts of maintaining a very tight urban footprint, and it really has to start with zoning. We talked a little bit about it at the end, but from a national concepts to state concepts to county and local, we all have to be pushing for zoning that protects 50% of Talmadge and 50% of Akron, and it's going to force civilization into tighter quarters, but we need to allow connections and enough habitat for, I mean, nature supports the air we breathe, the water we drink, the medicine that we come up with, our food. I mean, we're fully supported by the biosphere that we have. If we don't protect it, we're just dooming ourselves and our children and our grandchildren. So we need to be willing to give up, maybe my acre of land and move into a duplex or an apartment in, close to your church. Maybe those are the types of ideas that sort of have to be, it probably has to be done at sort of a zoning township scale level from the way I see it. But I do think it can be done. It seems like we're not close. It seems like we have a long way to go, but I do think that the ideas are there and it is doable. At least that's the way I feel about it.
Yeah. Annika and Rudy had another question. They asked, is making your yard a more natural habitat affordable to low-income families?
Absolutely. So it honestly, it doesn't take, I'm a really frugal person. I'm not low income, but I'm pretty cheap. So, a couple ways of doing it really inexpensively are using seed mixes rather than the plants themselves. You can get seed mixes with hundreds of species in the mix. And they won't all necessarily grow, but if you've prepared a small area of your yard and put a seed mix in it, you can get dozens of plant species filling that area within a year, just with some weeding, strategic weeding, so it's not just a dandelion patch at the end of the year. So you want to keep some weeds out, and you can put a small seed mix in. You don't even have to put a seed mix. If you just started eliminating the non-natives from a portion of your yard, allowing the seedlings to come up naturally from the squirrels and things like that, you can just kind of guide the succession of a portion of your yard into a natural state without anything more than some time. So there's various ways to do it. I've done it a number of different ways on my property, but I haven't spent a whole lot of money.
I also know as a gardener that the native species are more than introduced species, which are kind of, as you said earlier, sterile. It's easier to split and seed your own native species. So plant sharing becomes much more of an option, plant swapping and sharing when you're dealing with natives.
Yes, that's true. Those pesky exotics always seem to be the first ones to want to stick their foot in the ground, but they're just cued into, kind of like house sparrows. They're cued into human footprint, and they like what we do to our yards. So that can be an issue, and just knowing what they are can be overwhelming sometimes. So that's why if you have a couple target things to use, or you're doing plant swaps, like you say, then you know what you want, and you just get rid of everything else. But if you know more about the natives and exotics, you can actually just do the selection yourself in the space, and within a year or two have a completely naturalized area. So there's many different ways to kind of go about it, but yeah.
Now, you mentioned bug-free lighting towards the end. What is bug-free lighting?
You've probably seen those yellow bulbs. They can be incandescent, but they have some LED versions out now that are, they're typically, they're using wavelengths that the insects aren't attracted to. So they basically put a bunch of different colored lights out, and the ones the insects don't fly to, that's what they call bug-free. There's other terms that's used, but basically it's a light wavelength that doesn't attract as many insects.
So when replacing outdoor bulbs, we can look for bulbs that won't attract those insects to them during the night.
Yeah, and I would only say, I mean, the selection of those, I don't like them because they're yellow. They kind of have they don't look as attractive, but I just don't turn on the lights at night, or where I have lights that I want for our walkways and stuff. I have them all, you can buy the lights now that are LED, and they have the motion detector right in the bulb. So we use those bulbs, and then, it's on for 30 seconds when I need it to be on, and then it's off the rest of the night.
So how do you feel about houses festooned in Christmas lights, Rob?
Say again. I caught the Christmas lights.
Yeah, how do you feel about houses festooned in Christmas lights?
Well, the winter is the least amount of invertebrate impact. So lights in the winter there are still a lot of invertebrates that are out in the winter, honestly. But most of them are associated with streams or areas that stay frost-free. So winter is a fairly safe time to use the lighting, and it's our darkest time of year. So we're probably most prone to use lighting in the winter. It's really the summer lights that do the most damage to certain species or suites of species. Leaving those lights on all night long can really just eliminate a lot of species. And sometimes it's just the glow from your window. It can be that much in some cases. So I know there's at least one moth that in Southern Ohio I heard was going extinct. It just took, anytime a house would move in within like a 10-mile area of block of forest, the species would go away from that zone. So it was just really sensitive to light attraction, and it didn't take much. Most species aren't that sensitive, but it will definitely, you see what's coming to your lights. If you're getting a lot of stuff to your lights, those are species that you're warping their whole reproductive system, and they're just staying there at the light, and they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing out in your yard. So you can kind of get a sense of it, just what's coming. And if that's happening, then you probably want to change the light to a bug-free light, or see if you can get a motion detector on it.
Yeah. And then Sarah had a question. She said she has a section of her yard that is fenced in for her dogs, but are there any special considerations for dogs in particular, safe plants or plants that are risky to tick risks as some of the considerations that she's thinking of?
Yeah, ticks are, now I use my dog as our tick defense. So we put the pesticides in her. You can get from the vet the flea and tick medications, and so all of the ticks that get on her in our yard are killed. They're attracted to her, of course, because she's a dog, and they die. So that's how I manage ticks on my property. And it works really well. Of course, that is an insecticide, but I think it's a pretty discreet use of it. It's not like I'm spraying it around. And as far as other plantings, so safe plantings, I mean, plantings and ticks are an issue. I would say dogs and cats, if you're putting tick medication on them, are your best, one of the best ways I can think that you can defend your property, because they're going to favor those animals and then die. It's like a trap for them. And safe vegetation, most dogs and cats, I don't think you have to worry about that. And I mean, honestly, there's a lot of plants that are poisonous. So if you have a dog that likes to eat whatever it can get its mouth on, then you want to avoid things in the carrot family, like parsley. Although parsley is edible, a lot of things in the parsley or carrot family can be really deadly. That's the only one. Well, in the lily family too, there's some deadly ones. Even like tiger lily, I think, is pretty deadly. So I don't know what they all are.
Yeah.
But
and I think there are a lot of houseplants that are actually deadly to dogs and cats.
Yeah, philodendrons, I think, are really poisonous too. So yeah. I can answer that more fully if someone's interested, because I am really interested in food plants. I eat a lot of my natives. I can't grow vegetable gardens to save my life. So I know I have a pretty good feeling of what's poisonous and what's not and what's edible. If anybody's interested in that, I can answer offline sometime.
Okay. Well, Rob, I wonder if I can ask you to stop screen sharing there.
Yeah.
And I wanted to just thank you very, very much for your talk tonight, and really appreciate it. You made everything that we spoke about last week on a global scale real to our own backyards, and gave us some great ideas. So thank you so much. And again, thank you everybody who attended tonight and came along for this talk. If you've got questions, please feel free to reach out to Rob. He left his email for us in the chat on the slides, and we'll have a recording of this on our YouTube channel. And I wanted to just point out that Rob, again, like last week's talk, Rob is doing this free of charge. And thank you so much, Rob, for your time and your passion for this topic. But I wanted to encourage anybody who felt that they would like to make a donation to support this cause to think about. I just popped into the chat the Friends of Metro Parks, where is a place where you could make a donation to support the Metro Parks and the conservation of land in our local area. That would be great. And there are many organizations that support conservation and the protection of and encouragement of biodiversity. So Rob, thank you so much for tonight. Really appreciate your being with us.
No, I thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. It was great.